financial crises we had in the 19th century, precisely 19 of them, and the Civil War. Then we had World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Vietnam War, and yet the economy continued to grow. So I think that I would lean with Michael Power's view that, yeah, there are excesses in the economy. They've overbuilt in some sectors. But also Michael Gomez, he said sometimes you build a bridge and then the traffic comes. And in China, they built the infrastructure very early on, and then the traffic increased, and now you have also traffic jams. So I think that I'd rather be in the Chinese bubble situation where you have first-class railways, first-class roads, very modern infrastructure in some cities, than spending your $2 trillion on essentially nothing, on transfer payments for consumption.
Mark, that's just hideous. It's just hideous. You're building fantastic highways alongside fantastic railways, right? Now, that would be wonderful if we did it in America, where GDP per head is, what, $30,000. If I'm on $1 a day, you know what? I'm not in a hurry. I don't need a blasted electric train to travel at 200 kilometers an hour. It's wonderful when we transport it into our lives, and it has real economic significance. It has zero significance in China today because the payoff on it is disastrous. The generation that's funding it today will be bankrupt. Has anyone in this room invested in the first equity tranche of an infrastructure project? Let's think of Eurotunnel. Wow. No infrastructure project succeeds on the first equity tranche, the second, the third, the fourth. It's the vulture debt guy who comes in and buys it for 6 cents on the dollar. Right? That's my issue with China.
Yes. I agree with you. The Eurotunnel wasn't a good investment for the first investor, but it's a convenience for me to travel from London to Paris and back. So, I mean, it has an economic sense.
Yeah, but again, the optimal level of investment spending is one which maximizes over time the household's wealth and consumption. We know that the Asian spending model is wrong. Why do we know that? Because consumption as a percentage of GDP keeps falling. There was an Economist article on this 2 weeks ago, taking the data from 1981. I think it's fallen from 64 to about 45. In China, it's 35, and it continues to slip. Remember, the Chinese insist that their citizens are nothing but worker ants. They subsidize the great sovereign ambition of current account surplus. And that means they have to work for nothing. That means interest rates are nothing. That means they have to overpay for houses. Everything is done for the sovereign might of the current account surplus. And that's a bankrupt policy.
Listen, Hugh, you're a nice friend, but I disagree on many things that you just said. Because consumption in Asia, on a per capita basis, is not very high, but in aggregate is very powerful simply because of the population size. And you probably, Michael Powers, you have a different view, correct?
My view doesn't contradict yours. My view doesn't contradict yours, but I just wanted to make the historical point that while I would not have wanted to invest in the US railroads, which were probably the most extraordinary example of overcapacity at the time that they were done, there is very little doubt in my mind, looking back on that period of history, that had the US railroads not been built, the United States would not have gone on to be the great country that it was, and to some extent still is.
Actually, all canal companies in America went bankrupt, and 95% of the railroads by 1895 were in default. But Jeremy Siegel still writes books about how great stocks have performed between 1800 and today, when all the companies that existed in 1800, by 1840 they were bankrupt.
Let me just jump in and say that I also agree with Hugh on a static basis. And that if we assume that there's no change in terms of the policies that come out of China, that there is a tremendous possibility for a huge and very dangerous market disruption. But I also agree with something that Hugh said earlier, which was that these regimes are driven by power and to maintain power. And I think one change in emerging markets that we've seen is that politicians understand that the way to maintain power and political power is through economic growth and through prosperity and taming inflation, ultimately, that in many ways is a tax on the poor. So in order to maintain power in China, which I agree is the ultimate goal, a policy change will have to be effective.
But just one point. It is an easy thing to create GDP growth. Easy. It's another thing to create wealth. Now, the 10% real GDP growth, if you are building an office property in a city with a vacancy rate above 25%, you are adding to GDP growth, but you are taking away from wealth. If you remember, China is 8% of the world, $4 trillion economy, global economy is 50. And yet, is 50% of steel production, is 50% of aluminium, etc., etc. And I go one step further. China and commodities are the same trade. This is all about controlling the fat tail. The fat tail here, if I'm Chinese, is again that I lose this wonderful American economy which kept buying my product. I was getting $320 billion a year of credit, if you will, coming through. My Achilles heel is a depression, if you will, an American depression. Okay? Now, if I was running that system, my favorite asset would be my US Treasury bonds. Okay? But what do the Chinese do? They're down in Africa. They can't get enough of commodities. Now, what will be the very worst investment if we have a depression in America? So they've doubled up. It's the Belgian central bank game at lunchtime. It's mort subite. It's sudden death. Now, that's one way of organizing your affairs, but it's not the way I organize my hedge fund affairs.
No, I fully agree. I think this is a big risk for the world and for anybody related to commodities, the commodity producers. If, first of all, I'm convinced the Chinese economy will slow down this year. Question is, to what extent? Is it a collapse or a slowdown in growth from, say, 8-9% down to 5-7% or even lower? But for sure it will slow down because of the overcapacities that have been built. That is correct. But will it implode, as some people say? That I don't know. But if it does, then I would want to be long treasuries and long the dollar, and heavily long the dollar and treasuries. Anyway, I'd like to thank all the panel members for having patience and participating. Is there... Oh, you still have a question?
Yes, I have.
Yes, please.
Hugh, you kept us all in the room talking about this 1.5 downside and 75% upside, but you never told us the trade. So, what is it?
So that's a 1.5% downside, 75% upside, and I think I'm being modest in the assumptions I'm making on the 75. I'll tell you later. It's a secret.
Okay, thank you very much for participating. I give you my card.